Welcome to the LC3 Family Talk podcast, where we take a deeper look at everything from recent sermons to current events, all through a biblical lens. You'll love the guests and stories you'll hear on LC3 Family Talk, where our goal is connection, community, and relationship with God and with one another. And now, here's your host and one of our pastors, David Pritchard.
All right. Well, hello, Lake City, and any other friends and guests that are joining us. So glad that you're here on this episode of LC3 Family Talk. We have a really fun conversation planned for you. I think you're going to really enjoy. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of the things that have been going on that we're watching on news. And if we are a parent, I think sometimes when some of those things come across the news, it's hard to know what should we do with them. And so for this conversation tonight, I have a couple of friends I want to introduce you to. Directly next to me is Aleya McGinnis, and she has her MSW from University of Washington. She's worked in a grief program as a grief program coordinator at Marybridge Children's Hospital. That's what she's currently doing. But she's also been at Coffee Oasis. We might have to talk about that a little, because that was interesting, learning a little bit about that. But it's a place that supports teens, young adults that are experiencing homelessness. She did that for 4 years. But she's also been at Marybridge Emergency Department to do mental health. So you've done a lot, but you're passionate about supporting families that are grieving, which again is why I'm so grateful that you're here. And we're going to talk about that coming up. And then next to Aleya, I think is really somebody that we know and love here at Lake City, Dr. Jennifer Persis. She is a child psychiatrist in Tacoma. She received her medical degree from Chicago College of Osteopathic Medicine at Midwestern University. Say that fast. Lots of times. Wow. I like to call her, though, a unicorn. It's not often that you see Christians, devoted Christians, in this field of child psychiatry. And so I think it is a gift to us to have you in our body, but certainly a gift just to have your expertise in a lot of conversations that we've pulled you into. So thank you. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks.
I'm excited to have this conversation. We're going to talk about, as I mentioned, kids, maybe some of those harder conversations, but I thought let's start with something a little lighter. What's the funniest thing you've had a child say to you, or you've experienced a child?
So there is a story that is shared in my house, like my entire childhood. And it was a summer. My mom and my sister and I are a year and 5 months apart. So we're pretty close in age. And we were making popsicles. So it was fresh fruit and water and a little bit of juice, right? And my sister is at the freezer and opens it and then closes it and opens it and closes it. And she's getting more and more frustrated. She's like, they're not frozen. And my mom says, Lindy, it's going to be hours when it's done. And she just starts crying. And she's like, no, when it's done, it's going to be all mine. Because ours versus like ours as a community versus ours as in time. And it took my mom forever to figure out what she was saying with that. But like, that's just how like children are, right? Yes. Like, it's going to be hours until it's done. And just, she's like, no, it'll be all mine. It's just so funny to us.
That's awesome.
Good.
That's awesome.
I think this was actually a question I asked, but when one of my children was about 5 years old, and I must have been in a space of either feeling really playful, which is not uncommon for me, and or also needing some props as a mom. And I looked at my kiddo and I said, isn't mommy the best mommy in the whole world? And this child looked up at me and thought for a minute and then said, well, I don't know all the moms in the whole world. It's like, insane. Yeah, there's that. So yes, child, I am probably not the best mom in the whole world. You need to go meet Kelly Pritchard again.
The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree.
Right? From the mouth of babes.
Thanks for that. So, Aleya, you specialize in children and family grief. And I'm not going to say that word's thrown around a lot, but we do hear it a lot in our culture and certainly in church. When we say that word, what are we talking about when we talk about grief? What does that entail?
Yeah. Specifically for my work, it is children who are grieving the loss of a parent or sibling. But I think it's so important to identify that grief is so much more than just like the loss of somebody. Grief can be the loss of a relationship, whether that's like a breakup or parents' divorce, right? And then children are having to split time, or they're with half siblings half the time, and those kind of things. It can be the loss of a dream, right? You didn't get accepted into the college you wanted to. And there's a grief process with that. You didn't get the job you wanted. So there's a lot of different aspects where grief can come into place. Children having their parents be incarcerated, it's a huge grief and experience, as well as moving to new schools and like that loss of friendship. So grief to me is more than just the loss of a life. There can be so many other ways that grief can impact children.
So just tell me, you're looking at this all wrong, okay? I mean, is it fair to say that there's levels of grief, though? I mean, some things are just way, way harder than other things, or...
Sure. I could say that. I could understand that. And I think it really depends on the relationship or the situation and how that person is, like where that person's mental health is and where their emotional stability is to be able to process that information and the support to be able
from alongside. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
That's great.
I think one thing to throw in there too is, and this dovetails really nicely with actually the story you shared, Aleya, about your sibling, is it's important to remember that kids, especially younger kids, all they have is now, right? Like developmentally, all they have is what's right in front of them. And so the grief that the popsicles aren't ready or that the last cookie is gone, that grief can look very profound. And as an adult with fully formed frontal lobes, you're looking at them like, really, child? Really? We're going to do this now? But to understand that developmentally, those feelings are real. And as parents, that doesn't mean we let them wallow in it and let them have the last cookie be this be-all, end-all that's going to now color their life for the rest of their days, but understanding where they're coming from. Yes. Yeah.
That's good. So our conversation today, which prompted it to happen, is all the floods that happened down in Texas. It wasn't so much that I just wanted to talk about these floods in Texas, because they've been talked about a lot, but when things like that happen, if you're a parent especially, like, what am I supposed to do with my kid? The floods were crazy. Some of the stats I heard, it rose 26 feet in 45 minutes at 4 a.m. I mean, it's just like these ridiculous stats. This flash flood was awful. It was horrific. And so when all of that was going on, we were thinking about, if it was honestly, it was part of even what prompted us to think about doing a podcast at all, was being able to respond in real time to things like that. And so it really got me thinking about how can I talk to parents about this a little bit. My first call, of course, was Jen, and just to ask her, like, what could we do? In my experience, when my kids were younger, we had to go through 9/11, and literally, you know, we're watching TV and the experts on TV are saying, don't let your kids, you know, see all this. And we're like, oh man, we've already blown that. Right? But it brings up these questions, like, as a parent, like, what is healthy and what's not healthy? Does it matter? I'd love to just start there and maybe talk a little bit, like you mentioned younger kids and some of the ways they look at things. How do younger kids process something like 9/11 or something like the floods in Texas?
I think this is where it's another case where it's really important to understand children's development and where they are, because especially the younger a child is, they're still very engaged in fantastical thinking. Fantasy is huge, and fantasy is real to especially younger children, like 5 and under, but you can have magical thinking all the way up until 7, 8, 9. And I think one of the things, and maybe Aleya will talk about this too, but when kids are stressed, and especially if you're stressed with a big stress like grief, especially when it impacts the whole family, regression is very common. So even if you have a kid who's grown out of that magical thinking phase, it wouldn't be unusual for some of that to come back.
And that's what you're calling regression?
Yes. Sorry. So to regress, I guess it might sound pejorative. I don't mean it. I mean it in a very academic way, not a pejorative way. It just means you're going back to a previous developmental time where you've actually
pull out a dictionary for all of this.
It just means that, so regression in the way I'm using it right now just means that a kid has grown developmentally to a certain stage and then kind of retreats back to a younger developmental stage. So all that background to say, I think that's where a lot of the wisdom and the recommendations about not letting kids be bathed in all the media, like watching the Twin Towers fall over and over, because that can feel very real to especially younger children. I think even watching, I confess I have not watched. I've heard about the floods and some of the media coverage, but I haven't watched the scenes of it. But I can imagine if you're talking about those floodwaters rising that quickly in that period of time, watching that could be very scary, especially for younger kids, especially if they don't know how to swim or if they've had a bad experience around water. So a lot of it is knowing your own kid, knowing where they're at, and really watching how they're responding to things. If they're becoming too interested in it, where they're watching it over and over and they can't seem to separate, or if you notice every time it comes on, they're averting, they're looking away, they're not wanting to engage. So it's having extra sensitivity towards seeing where the kiddos around you are at.
I know one of the common questions that kids will have, I know this happened during 9/11. I can't remember if our kids had this question as often, but is this going to happen to us now?
100%.
Are we next?
Right.
Is this flood going to happen here? Is
Yep.
the plane going to crash in our house? Which I think speaks to what you're talking about.
Yeah. And I think providing factual answers the best that we can and reassurance, and at the same time being willing to engage in the conversation. So to not minimize and just throw it away and say, oh, no, honey, that would never happen here. It's fine. Let's go watch Bluey. That's what I would do. I mean, I would want to watch Bluey. So you don't want to minimize. You want to be able to take these teachable moments and have the hard conversation.
I mean, they're hearing about kids dying. So is grief coming in now, or what would you say?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I'd like to pair off of that too, is that imagination, like those magical thinking and things. Children often, when they recognize that they're not being told something or that they're just missing information, they will create their own answers to those solutions or to what could have happened, right? And so I think there's a space of, yes, we want to answer questions and share in an age-appropriate way to explain the situation, but also making sure that what their understanding of it, like asking, like, what do you think it means? Or what do you think happened? Because if they're sharing, well, the mermaids did this, like, well, we probably need to have another conversation because the mermaids didn't do it, right? Like, we want to bring it back to the reality of that, because we also don't want them to create a concrete understanding of the imaginary. I know, like, in our family, we get together in my family, there's 5 kids. And so when we get together, we're always sharing stories and things like that. And so it's something that I found multiple times where we'll all have very different recollections of the same story. Mm-hmm. And my sister and I, being the youngest of the 5, might have more of that magical thinking. And because in our reality, that became the truth. And we believed it, and that fused for us. And so just making sure and having those conversations with children so that there is more of that, like, what is the true reality in those situations? Also, to the point of the regression that you mentioned, we often see children's toileting habits change. They go from they can fully toilet themselves and go to the bathroom and all those things to their bedwetting. They can't sleep by themselves. They need to sleep in bed with mom or dad or whoever is the surviving parent. And so that definitely, on the same lines of the regression, is a very common thing that we see at Bridges as well.
So let me bring the gospel into this for a minute. And then as we walk through this, in that pointing them to the truth, that's part of the truth we point them to. But there's a tension in there. I was thinking about, like, what are some of the verses? So here's one. This is Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, always ready to help in times of trouble. So we will not fear when earthquakes come and the mountains crumble into the sea, let the oceans roar and foam, but the mountains tremble as the waters surge. We have these verses in God's word that we get comfort from. But at the same time, like, to your point, like, we also are not saying, so it won't happen.
Right.
We have God, like, none of this will happen. Are there some things that you would suggest, like, we should say, or some things that we should stay away from saying? I agree that even with the gospel, I think sometimes we can be so flippant with things. Oh, God will take care of it. We don't want to do that. But how do we navigate that? What are some ways, some things that we can be saying or avoid saying?
I think always and never statements should be avoided because they're never always going to be true. But like the reality of it is it's not going to be 100%. This world ends with us dying and going to heaven, right? Or going to another, like teaching those to children and recognizing that death is a part of life. I am a big advocate of talking about that early on with children, from like aspects of your animal, of like, oh, the plant that we had in our house, oh, it lost its son and whatever. The soil wasn't good
Your
enough.
plants die too?
Yes. Yes, they do. But having those conversations with kids and sharing and recognizing what that looks like and having those conversations early can help some of those preparations for when somebody does die. Or if you're at church and you hear that there's somebody who may be older in the community who has passed, right? Having those conversations with the kids. I love doing education with kids, like when you go to the doctor's office and like, let's listen to our heartbeat together, and like, what does that mean when you take a deep breath? That means like your body's filling with oxygen, your heart's beating. And if they ask those questions, well, what happened to them? Remember when we listened? This is an example. Remember when you listened to your heart and like if that stopped beating, that would mean that the person's heart stopped. And that means that the person may not be living anymore. And we can do measures to try to help that person. And that when you can't breathe anymore. Anyway, I can go and I like to teach that way. Personally, obviously, it's going to be in what the child's understanding and is capable of.
I totally agree with all of that. And recognize the desire to protect our kids. And almost none of us, most of us don't enjoy watching our kids experience distress. We've talked about this before. Distress tolerance is actually a really important skill to learn.
Yeah.
So if we're protecting our kids from every distressing thing ever, we are actually doing them no favors. It's much more helpful to acknowledge the distressing thing and then model how we can regulate around it. And so I guess one of the things I want to add in part of this conversation is it's not just about the words we say to our kids, what we share, what we don't share. We've got to keep ourselves in check. So if we're sitting there watching, okay, they just found kid number 27. If we're doom scrolling and we're becoming distressed ourselves about the whole thing, 95%, I just made that number up. It's not true. But the majority of what, especially our younger kids, are going to experience in a big moment like this, whether it's 9/11, whether it's the floods, whether it's war, let's say you're a family that has relatives in Ukraine or some other place, anyone who's experiencing this, especially the younger the kids, they are looking to their parents to say, how am I supposed to be feeling about this? And what's the meaning I make out of this for myself? And if we can go to the gospel, we can go to God's word and figure out what's the meaning we make out of this. God's word is full of examples where things don't go the way we want them to. And telling any of those stories, even thinking about what came to my mind as you were reading the verse from Psalm, was actually the story of Jesus and the disciples on the boat with the storm. And the storm is great. It would be an opportunity to share some of these stories. And if you're going through a loss or something where it doesn't turn out well, like it doesn't turn out with Jesus calming the waves in that moment and knowing that you're safe. Like maybe it's Lazarus died and it's before Jesus has come back to bring him back to life. Talking about what must that be like and how do we trust God in those hard moments. I think that if we can teach our kids that, add them a job.
I can lay out for you a lot of parenting fails. One of my better moments was during 9/11 because our kids were scared.
Yeah.
And again, we hadn't heard all the experts until after we'd done all this, but they saw some of the because we were watching it on TV and just, shocked like everybody else. And I noticed our kids starting to get scared. And I just remember in the moment saying, you guys, I know this is hard, but we are not going to be afraid. God is still in charge. God is still on the throne. We trust ultimately everything to the Lord. And I even wrote down Jesus calming the sea. The other one is Matthew 7. The rains came, the floods came, that if our house is built on a firm foundation, and again, it comes back to a little bit of that tension because yes, there are times where even though we do trust, even though we do believe, bad things still happen this side of heaven. And that's why we have the promise of what happens next, which we always fall back on. As we talk about, one of the questions I had was, what do you think's the hardest thing for kids to handle when it comes to something like this flood or 9/11? What would you say to that?
A good question. I think the things that come to mind for me is the uncertainty or instability. Children thrive with consistency, routine, knowing what to expect. It doesn't mean they won't buck up against expectations, but knowing what to expect. And something like this rocks all of our world because it's like, well, now I don't know what can I trust in.
I'm so glad you said that, because this honestly is probably one of the things that I don't want to be use too much hyperbole, but it bothers me, concerns me, is, so I'll give you an example. And this was years ago now, because our kids ran in the house, but it was sort of the first sign. It was the first time this happened. One of the kids on our son's baseball team got in a wreck, and the whole baseball team was coming from a thing at their coach's house. No one was drunk. They just got in a wreck, and it was a pretty bad wreck. Nobody died, thankfully, but Avita, our son, called us right away. We got down there. By the time we got there, kids were pouring in because all the kids were texting all of their friends. And so one of the dynamics we're seeing is kids going through these things without us as parents and adults involved to give that consistency. And that, am I overreacting in that?
To clarify, are you asking like that children are going to other children versus going to the adult?
Yeah. Yes, but obviously that's not the littlest children. They start getting up into the middle school years, and they have their phones and their apps, and they're now getting all their news and their information, and even how they're supposed to react from everyone except for us. I'm overreacting.
I wouldn't say that you're overreacting by any means, especially because it's coming from a protective space. Like, you care so deeply, right? You care what your children are receiving and what that looks like. It's hard for me because most of my experience with teens particularly is in a space where they did not have strong relationships with parents. And so those relationships and what that looked like, their street community became their family.
That is their only...
That is the family that they have. And so to me, I smiled when you said that, because I was like, wow, that's so beautiful that the community were so quick to respond to them, because I see that in the youth that I've worked with, right? That their community of friends is their family, right? And they don't always have those strong role models. And so for me, as somebody who has become kind of an auntie to a lot of these young adults and these teenagers, I would want them to reach out to me, right? And I can provide some of that. So I don't think you're overreacting.
I don't think you're overreacting. I think we don't want to shut down the community and the reaching out and the seeking that fellowship and that not aloneness with their peers, because that's so important. And that's true for school age kids. It's true for middle school. It's true for adolescents. The sameness with peers, the feeling of belonging is paramount. And having responsible adults in the room who can guide, who can help model how to regulate. Yes.
You don't want me just rambling on for an hour about some topic.
It's not always going to be the parents, right? But sometimes you're the surrogate parents.
That's right.
I think it's really important to empower our youth, because as much as, and this is especially true for adolescents, as much as they want to feel grown up and they're starting to stretch their wings and they're feeling like, yeah, I got this, I'm going to be independent. They all, if they're willing to be honest with themselves, have those moments of, I'm still just a kid. Like, what the heck? And this is very overwhelming. And so I really like to frequently salt and pepper the conversation with, there are some things that are still grown up. I've had this conversation with my now 16-year-old. There are certain things where it's like, you need to let the grown-ups do what grown-ups need to do in this situation. It doesn't mean you don't have a role. It doesn't mean you don't still talk to your friends. but you've got to get grown-ups involved. And if they don't have a good relationship with their parents, who is their trusted auntie?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's both and. You're not overreacting, and it's lovely.
And more
They have each other.
Well, there.
Yeah. But we need to be aware. We need to be ready to speak in. We need to be ready to engage and not always wait for them to come to us necessarily. Do the check-ins.
Because the other thing that came to mind thinking about all of this conversation, but also just the crisis that we are, they're a lot. We've gone through. We know the truth. They're going to go through more.
Yeah.
And something I say often to people that come and ask for prayer, ask for counseling is, God never promises that life's going to be this smooth sailing, no challenges, no floods, no earthquakes. But what he does is that he'll never leave us or forsake us. Mm-hmm. And so even in hearing you talk about that community, like, part of the message I want our kids to hear is, look, there is one that will never leave you or forsake you. Okay. And he's always going to be there for you. And we're going to try our best to always be there, but we can't always. We certainly are going to try.
Can I offer one other score that came to mind as we were talking about it? Because I had seen this in a Facebook group where a physician was reaching out and their child had gone through something that was really challenging and they were looking for a therapist. It was like, okay, we got to find a therapist. And I don't remember the details. I feel like it was a loss, though. I feel like it was a peer guide. So everybody was jumping on the get him in therapy. And I just want to put a plug in for not there. Okay, I'm a huge proponent of therapy, for the record. And I'm a huge proponent of community and for parents still being parents and other trusted adults being trusted adults. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things about Bridges. They're not going and getting psychotherapy. They are in a peer group with others, understanding this is a normal part of life.
Well, and this goes back to if we want to build grit,
right?
We do have to help them walk through hard things.
Right.
What does that look like to walk through a hard thing?
Right. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times the desire to get kids into therapy when they've gone through something hard or had a traumatic experience, which again, please hear me.
Yeah, we're not saying...
I'm not saying I am the least anti-therapy person you'll meet. That might not be true, but I'm very pro-therapy. And I think a lot of times that's coming from a place of, I feel ill-equipped and I'm afraid I'm not going to be enough for my kid or that I'm going to screw something up, and give ourselves a chance to be there for our kids, with our kids, as a community, as a small group, and to walk the hard together. And then as you walk it, if you're like, okay, we're out of our depth now, we need some professional help, get professional help. Don't outsource all of the be with thing.
Yes. Yeah. I can put a plug in for LC3. I mean, that's why we just hired somebody and we're hiring more to help us think through what does it look like to provide some actual counseling for folks. But we still say, like, first line of help is community groups. Like, be with your community and walk through things with your community. Do that. But if you need more help, professional help, then
absolutely,
by all means, go get that.
With what you were sharing, and you mentioned it earlier too, parents, they do mess up, right? It's going to happen. Yeah. And children and teens.
We never did.
Sure. But somebody included. Children and teens need to see that. They need to see it. I think one thing, I am a young adult and I came into adulthood and I had these expectations that now I have to be perfect. Now I can't mess up anymore. And that's not true. There's never going to be the reality that adults or anybody in the world doesn't have failings, right? That just is the reality of it. And I think a lot of teens look up to people who they don't see having any failure, and it creates unrealistic expectations for them. So I think that's part of it. And community, particularly going through grief and going through crisis, is so foundational. And for our program, what we offer at Bridges is support groups. So it's that children recognize they're not alone in their grief, then they're not the only one who is feeling this way, or the only one who's lost a brother or a sister or lost a mom and dad. And I think so easily do children and teens go, I'm the only one. I'm the only one that's depressed. I'm the only one who's thought this way. I'm the only one who gets mad, which is not true, but that is so classic to adolescents in general, is that I'm the only one.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to grief or these other situations that affect our lives, to come into community is so important. And I love therapy, but I am a huge advocate for support groups and therapeutic groups, because I think that children and teens in particularly need to see that they're not the only one going through the situation.
And I'm not going to disagree. I'm just going to add to that. I think it's human to feel that way because, we've both been involved with Reengage, our marriage ministry. And I think one of the most common realities and most common thing we hear from couples that come to Reengage, our marriage ministry, is, oh my goodness, it's not just us.
We're not the only one.
We always think, if everyone knew what I'm going through, like they wouldn't like me or they wouldn't believe it. And they don't realize everyone else is going through the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
So thank you. That is absolutely true. Any suggested resource for parents that are hearing this and saying, okay, I want to read more or I want to listen to more?
Oh, I should have come prepared with that. I can find some specific things that we can link.
We'll put them in the show notes.
Yes, in the show notes, exactly. I will say off the top of my head, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, which is the professional body for my profession, I do not agree with everything that they say or all of their position statements, to be clear. So if somebody goes and looks on their website, there are lots of things there that, as a believer, I do not ascribe to or agree with. However, they do have resources on there about this very thing, talking about working with kids in the midst of disaster, crises, trauma. So that's a good place to start. And you can just Google aacap.org. And there's a whole section called Facts for Families, where you can find lots of information about a lot of different topics. Again, some of it I stand behind, some of it I take issue with, but that would be one resource for the trauma and grief stuff.
When it comes to specifically grief, because that is my world and what I work in, the NACG, so National Alliance for Children's Grief, has so many resources. They have podcasts and webinars for caregivers and for people who are professionals. There are lots of worksheets that can be printed out to use with children and teens as well. And they have so much of it in English and Spanish as well, which I think is a huge resource. I love that they did that. So that is one website that I think is pretty incredible to support children that are experiencing the grief of somebody close to them in their life. For children who have lost in say you're a caregiver or that you're a loved one that is trying to support a child right now, Camp Erin, there's 37 of them around the U.S. And they also have now Camp Erin online. And so these are grief camp experiences that can be so supportive for kids. So if you're in the area to be able to go to one, I highly recommend. If you're not, then Camp Erin online is pretty incredible. But then when it comes to books to read with kids, there are so many children's books around grief. And there's some that are really incredible. And they do it in a way that they're talking, it's animals talking together. It's the life cycle of, there's one that's a life cycle of a water bug into a dragonfly. And it's probably my favorite one. They're very cute. There's just so many books to be able to help a child process that in a way that is more manageable for them.
Thank you both. The last plumber for LC3, and that is, please, if you want to talk to somebody, if you've got questions, don't ever hesitate. We have an intake form at the church office that you can fill out and get somebody to meet with you and talk with you, because we believe that there is a place for all of the things that we've talked about, but we always would say we start with, what does God's word say? How do we do this in biblical Christian community? And then we have these other resources that can help us when we find ourselves in places where we just don't, what did you say? You don't want to screw it up, where we don't know that we have all the answers. And you guys, thanks so much for joining me. And thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for connection, community, and relationship here on LC3 Family Talk. See you next time.